Okay, now that the post-flight review is done, it's time to get to the build review. See if I can get through this really quickly. One of the things I found is that this airplane went together fairly easily. I did not have any of the problems of parts fitting together. They all fit just the way they were supposed to fit. It took a little time because there's a lot of parts to put on, but I didn't have any trouble with fit with this airplane. And I'll get to some of the reasons I mentioned that where other people had trouble. But first, I'm going to start with the steerable tail wheel. When you get the fuselage of this airplane, and without the wing on it, without the bottom wing assembled, if you look up in there, one of the things you'll notice is your rudder and elevator servo are underneath, they're in the cutout in the fuselage under the bottom wing. And the rudder servo has one servo arm, but it has two control rods that come off of that arm. One control rod goes to the rudder, right there. The other control rod comes off the same arm and comes over to the tail wheel. Now, the rudder control rod is a hook type control rod where it just hooks into the servo arm. So the rudder is adjusted out here at the clevis. The tail wheel is not that way. The tail wheel, there's no adjustment out here for the tail wheel. The adjustment is on a slip collar. So even though it shares the same lever on the servo, it's a different setup. The control rod for the steerable tail wheel goes to a slip collar, and you have to loosen and tighten that slip collar inside the fuselage to position the tail wheel. And you have to do that with the wing off. So that's one reason why before you assemble the airplane, it's a good idea, and I did this, is I bound my receiver before I plugged in the airplane and bound in the receiver before assembling it. That way I can get the elevator and rudder servo powered up along with the motor, test those three. And I can also check the centering, the neutral centering of the arms, control arms on those two servos. And I did that, but what I found was when the rudder servo was centered and the rudder was centered, the tail wheel was 45 degrees off to one side. So I took that time with the centered rudder servo to adjust the tail wheel, loosened up that slip collar and adjusted the tail wheel to make it straight and tighten that down. Once you put the wing on, you can't do that. So you want to make sure that's centered before you assemble the airplane. Alright, the next thing about the assembly that some people have trouble with is the wings, or mainly the struts. Some of the complaints that I've read are that the struts, especially on the fuselage side, don't line up with their attach points on the wing. I didn't have any trouble with that. I approached it with that in mind. What I did was I attached the metal struts to the fuselage first, but I didn't tighten them all the way. I only tightened them down just enough to where I had wiggle room on the strut. They can only go on one way. If I flip this over on the other side, these two holes will not line up with the bottom over there, so it can only go on one way. But I installed it loose, without the wing up here, just onto the fuselage. I did the same thing with the outer struts. I installed them onto the lower wing, loosely. Now there's 16 screw points. It takes a while to do this. 16 screw points to do this. You have the 4 here, 4 there, that make 8. 4 here, and 4 there, that make 8. So 16 screw points all together. The fuselage screws don't have nuts. They screw into screw points into the fuselage. The other 14 points are screws with nuts on them. So it takes a little time because you have to hold the nut and you got to tighten the screw. But once again, I put them on the wing first, the lower wing first, and I put them on loosely so I had a little bit of play. Same with the other side. Then you set the wing down on top and there's going to be some slop because you left those loose. What that enables you to do is to move the wing around, the top wing around, so that you can get a screw started in the top wing to its associated strut. And you start it, get a nut on it, but don't tighten it. You do the same thing to the front and back. You do the same thing over here. Now the outboard struts, I could only put the outboard struts on the outboard side of the tabs where they mount to. I originally tried to put them on the inboard side, but for some reason when I did that, this one in the back, because it's angled in, get my pointer in there. If the strut was over on this side, because it's angled in, it would hit the foam before it line up the hole, so it has to be on the outside. So once you get all of these started and you get a nut on every single one of them all the way across, takes a little time. Now the wing is fully engaged with all the holes in the struts, and it's still sloppy because they're a little loose. Then you tighten them down incrementally. I think I worked my way with the inner struts. I tightened down the nuts and screws incrementally along with the bottom. I did both of those, and I did the same thing with the outer struts. If you do it that way, the wings will line themselves up the way they're supposed to be, and you don't have that problem of one hole not lining up. That only happens mainly when you tighten the first part down first before you put a screw in the hole on the top wing. You really want to have everything loose until you have a screw and a screw and a nut and everything before you start tightening. Okay. Okay, once the wing problem is all settled and your wings are on, the next thing you're going to have to deal with are the clevises. On the tail, the clevises are already installed and the control rods are already hooked up and the clevises are installed. All you got to do is separate them and adjust them if you need to adjust the neutral on the flight controls. The wings, you have to actually install the control rod and the clevis to the lower wing. These clevises are very stout and they're very rugged, and are also very difficult to separate and to snap. So the best thing to do is make sure you have your adjustment correct. You know, you can install the center pin without actually snapping it closed. Make sure you got them where you want them before you snap them closed and lock them, because they're very hard to unlock. You can't just stick a screwdriver in there on some of these and twist them and pop them. You really have to get a fingernail under each side and work at it for a while to get them to release. And they don't always go together, snap back together easily. I actually had to replace one with an existing one that I had because I bent the center pin trying to get it to snap back together. So they're very difficult to operate, these clevises, as far as separating them or releasing them and reclosing them. So make sure you get it right the first time. Alright, the next thing are the lights. This airplane comes with wingtip lights, and they come with leading edge lights on the lower wing. I already talked about the lights as far as how you run them. The manual tells you absolutely nothing about the lights. It doesn't even mention them. The word lights doesn't appear once in the manual. But you have the light setup, so you have to work that out on your own. Now the light wires for the lower wing, they run in there with the servo wires, so they're right there in the fuselage when you need them. The upper wings, however, they run the wires through these little cutouts, and then they stop and they tie them off here and they leave them for you to deal with. I ended up taking my wires for the lights and running them down behind this metal strut, the aft strut on the aft side. I run them forward on the back side of the strut, and I drilled a hole in the fuselage to fit the plug and the wire through. It doesn't come with a hole where you can fit the wire and plug through. It does have an existing hole behind this strut. You can barely get to it. It's a small hole. That was put there for the wires back in the day before they actually put the plugs on the wires. Originally, these things came wires and they were just capped off with no plugs. And they were expecting you to run the wire through the fuselage and put a connector on it. Now they come with the connectors and they tie them off. But you have to make your own hole to fit the connector through. I did that on both sides. And they give you a pigtail wire that goes to the receiver. They give you two. One has a little control. One has a control unit to it, like a little circuit board in the middle of it. That's if you want to have your wingtips flashing. The other one is just a pigtail to the receiver to the wires, and that's if you don't want them flashing. They're steady, and you can hook that one up. You have a choice of which one to use, but like I say, the manual doesn't tell you anything about them. You just kind of have to figure that out on your own.